but I don't know for sure. It's like I say, it's all tied up with the Israeli mistake. But the Israeli mistake does not eliminate the ill winds. It just seems to contribute to them. So in other words, we have ill winds relative to the swine flu. We have ill winds relative to the powers that be in their attempt for population control, and then we have the ill winds related to the Israeli mistake. The Israeli mistake does not eliminate the other two sources of that same set of archetypes.
Okay, and also a couple other topics I'd like to touch on. Unruly Julie says thank you, by the way.
Sure. I love that name. That's great.
Yeah, that's
Unruly
awesome.
Julie, yes.
Nibiru is one subject. The December context change is another subject. And
okay, let's just deal with those two right at the moment. The Nibiru thing, there is some support for near-Earth objects giving us some problem, but I don't have anything in my data to suggest that is anything more that the Nibiru or Giant Planet X or Nemesis is anything more than a tool being used by the powers that be to generate fear and also segregate populace. In other words, they can actually say, and they have and are doing, they're creating memes and saying, how many people can we get to buy into this? What will it take to flesh this out to the point where we can get it to be a self-sustaining community that would then go off and burn energy doing this other stuff? The military does that kind of thing now, and they're paying people to generate these kinds of situations online. So, but our data shows the Nibiru or Planet X or let me just shade it all the way over to near-Earth orbiting objects or passing objects. And we do have some small amount, a little tiny bit of support for it being a reality in the future in the sense of a flyby that causes some problems. But we don't have anything to support the idea of a giant planet filled with, huge Anunnakis or whatever the hell live there coming to cause us problems. It just doesn't show up. It only goes so far and it stops. And it's kind of it's one of those things where we can actually see some memering going on some of these other threads. Now, this idea of Nibiru is not like that in the sense that we can't trace it back to a government op somewhere or a government set of IP addresses as the way we can with some of the memering. But it does seem to go back to basically a single source, which is ultimately it originates back to the Sitchin writings. And because of that, there's no other historical support within our data to give us a broader archetype. Historical support instead of running out in a pyramid fashion, broader archetype goes down a couple of layers in a widening pyramid and then starts narrowing, and so thus becomes this sort of diamond-shaped. And so those are the kind of things where we know we're dealing with or we suspect we're dealing with disinformation, where it doesn't have that broader base pyramid support of archetypes underneath it.
Okay.
Now, on the other side, the context change on the 29th, we should be able to give you a better idea of what words will be associated with that in the early December run.
Okay.
Right at the moment, we kind of think that, well, let me put it this way. The context change is an aggregation of a lot of different emotional sums that seem to focus in on one broad archetype under which, acting as an umbrella, a larger number of similar subjects are housed. So in other words, the last time we had a context change, the context change at the largest level, the highest level of the archetype, was immigration. One step down from that was undocumented worker or illegal immigration. And so our context changed because all of a sudden that was what was in the mainstream and it became a major thread. We had all different kinds of demonstrations of the emotional power of that, and it changed the context in a rather short period of time of, say, less than a month. And it started on a particular day. This time our context change is clearly involving the dollar. And so it might be that on December 29th, the federal government would go ahead and say declare bankruptcy. And in that case, they wouldn't send out Social Security checks or any other entitlement, and we might even have the Constitution officially suspended while the government tries to work out its issues of not being bankrupt anymore. That kind of a context change would be what we call a sole point source context shift, whereas the immigration came from all over the place, even though it was sort of controlled, and even though it was sort of leaked out and managed, nonetheless, it arose in multiple different places, more or less all at once. The context change for the 29th of December seems to support the idea that it will be from the top down, so to speak, or will go through society that way, as opposed to coming from the bottom up, the way we saw with the mass marches of the undocumented workers, etc.
Okay.
Okay, so it wouldn't surprise me to see, for the context change, to see any number of strange things occur, but they're all going to be related to human kind of activity. In other words, context changes are not usually, in fact, in our history, have never been associated in our work with anything like natural disasters or any of that. Those show up under a different kind of situation.
Okay. And also, I just wanted to let everybody out there in the chat know I'm trying to monitor the questions here so we can get to them. I like what you're doing where you just put it in bold every once in a while. That way I can kind of keep an eye on it. But also, just so you know, this is actually Light Essence 37 from YouTube. I'm not Trevor. This is not the normal host. He's kind of been missing for a while, so I'm just kind of doing an improv stand-in here. So I hope you all bear with me. I'm trying to do my best for you.
Very well done, Dave. We appreciate it.
And magnetosphere, Cliff, is a... I need to get to that one. There's Paulie's Customs is really adamant about getting to that.
Yeah, the magnetosphere is very troubling. Here's the issue with that. It actually has degraded to the point where if we were to look at the Earth, and you imagine the atmosphere as being bigger than the Earth, and say that in your mind you thought of the atmosphere as having, say, 60% more volume than the Earth, so it's out there a ways. The magnetosphere hovers on the other side of the planet and is probably, let's just say, 400 times the volume of the atmosphere in terms of the area that it encompasses. Mm-hmm. So what I'm about to tell you will sort of make sense. Our magnetosphere, even though it surrounds our Earth, has several Earth-size holes in it. Some of these Earth-size holes are multiple Earth-size holes, and it's causing real problems. There are areas of the planet down Patagonia, even now into the Caribbean with the South Atlantic anomaly, and there's one area over the, I think it's over Ghana now in Africa that's smallish, but nonetheless the magnetosphere is quote, degrading, and it is allowing extra radiation to come in. This is not a good situation at all. It will certainly be associated with mutations. It'll certainly be associated with all kinds of rises in first-generation mutations like cancers and this kind of thing, as opposed to multiple-generation mutations that might even be viable, but certainly will produce birth defects. It will certainly impact fertility in a general scale because of the kinds of radiations coming on in. And it is not a good thing because it's becoming, the magnetosphere holes are becoming more stable, and that's the really frightening part. It is apparent that we're going through a transitional phase, not only as humans on this planet and all of our mucking about with each other, but also the planet and the solar system itself. Mm-hmm. It may indeed be that this apparent magnetosphere crisis could, for instance, we could have our context change in December not relate to the dollar and not be the result of a natural disaster, but might relate to our sudden realization as to, for instance, how we now have to start living with ourselves because of a looming environmental collapse. So in other words, if the context change were to tweak a certain way, it might be a green crisis, so to speak, where something triggers the powers that be to let the word out as to just how fragile the whole Earth system is, and there's nothing we can do about it. I don't think they're ready to release that kind of information, and it really does appear to come out in the revolutionary period of time, but I'm just throwing it out because we don't yet have a handle on the 1229 context change.
Okay.
But anyway, the magnetosphere is troubling because there's another aspect of it that's a little bit interesting, to say the least. And that is that when the magnetosphere is weak, a CME could come through from the sun and cause vast quantities of damage. Further, it is theoretically feasible that a CME from the sun, a coronal mass ejection, that is preceded by what do they call those? Not flares. The
solar flare.
Prominences. Yeah, correct. But the prominence itself throws off a magnetic field. Mm-hmm. If that's followed by a magnetic bow wave that's being pushed along, so to speak, by the coronal mass ejection, and the magnetic bow wave would not dissipate the way that they normally would. Thus, the coronal mass ejection itself, those ultra high energy particles, are pushing along an intense magnetic bubble, if you will, or part of a bubble ahead of them. This is key because that magnetism itself can cause problems with our magnetosphere. In its weakened stage, if we were to receive a southern or south pole impacting south pole or negative energy magnetic bubble from the sun, our magnetosphere would go spinning around like it was a top. I mean, I kid you not, it would become totally displaced and go whipping around.
What do you think that would do to our weather and whatnot?
Certainly would screw the weather up, there's no question about it. And during the period of time that the CME was coming in, with the magnetosphere spinning, so to speak, relative to the Earth, if the Earth were stable, it would allow the radiation to come on in various different areas. In other words, the holes would in the magnetosphere right now might allow radiation to come in and